J.G. Ballard agreed with artist Eduardo Paolozzi that violence would play the same role in the 70s and 80s as sex had played in the 50s and 60s. Then, in 1971, while writing his latest novel, blending fetishistic violence with pop culture and strangeness, Britain appeared to agree. With the emergence of violent movies such as Stanley Kubrick's A Clockwork Orange, Sam Peckinpah's Straw Dogs, and Mike Hodges' Get Carter, it appeared to be ready for the extreme visions of Ballard. Well, they were not. And indeed, neither was the world. Welcome to House of Words, a podcast about writers, car crashes, and madness. I am your host, Jason Nemore Harden, inviting you to join us as we explore the life and writing of J.G. Ballard, and in particular, his controversial novel, Crash. Quote, "My father worked and my mother played bridge. Every time I went out of the house, I was chauffeur-driven with my nanny next to me to stop me being kidnapped." End quote. James Graham Ballard was born to English parents in Shanghai, China on November 15, 1930. His mother, a school teacher, taught him to read before entering school at age 5. He read children's editions of Alice in Wonderland, Robinson Crusoe, and Gulliver's Travels between reading American comics and magazines. He would later say how Alice, the Red Queen, and Man Friday would crowd a mental landscape also occupied by Superman, Buck Rogers, and Flash Gordon. His favorite American comic strip was Terry and the Pirates, which he described as a wonderful oriental farrago of Chinese warlords, dragon ladies, and antique pagodas that had the added excitement of being set in the China where he lived. James was left to himself for long periods of time, during which he pretty much read any and everything he could find. Not only American comics, but Time and Life magazine, as well as the Saturday Evening Post and the New Yorker. Simultaneously, he read childhood classics such as Peter Pan and Winnie the Pooh. A big turning point occurred at age 12 when he produced his first piece of writing. In school, he and his schoolmates were instructed to copy lines from stories. According to James, the teachers really didn't care at all if they wrote it line by line. All that mattered was to see that the paper was covered. Well, it was while copying the lines of a thriller that young James realized that it was easier if he didn't bother at all to transcribe, rather just to make up the story himself. It was then that he first discovered how exciting it was to invent things. That set him off. In the interim, the Second Sino-Japanese War commenced, lasting from 1937 to 1945, forcing the Ballards to abandon their suburban home and move to the city center of Shanghai in order to avoid the warfare. And by the time the war ceased, Ballard was 15 years old and on his way back to England with the family. Upon arriving in Plymouth circa late 1945, early 46, he was faced with what he considered to be an incomprehensible and strange new life, one which his childhood of extensive reading had prepared him for in more ways than he'd realized. Fortunately, there would be vast amounts of new literature to comfort him, but also a new venture of pop culture to explore, cinema. So for the next 4 to 5 years, he put reading mostly aside and dove into movies. He saw a connection between the works of Hemingway, Nathaniel West, Kafka, and Camus, and the up-and-coming Hollywood films of the time, such as Citizen Kane, Sunset Boulevard, and White Heat. Around this same time, he found his way into the world of psychoanalysis and surrealism, a fusion that would fuel the short stories he was already writing and which would further his decision to start reading and studying about medicine. Roughly 20 years old upon entering the annual short story competition in Cambridge, he won. Already convinced by then that he wanted to be a writer, the award was reassurance. 'Reassurance,' 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 'reassur By the time he came out of the Air Force at the age of 24, he'd written a number of short stories and was also, according to him, vaguely writing a novel. He felt, however, that something was missing from most of the fiction being published at the time. It didn't seem real enough or interesting enough. He felt that the sort of fiction people were writing in those days just wasn't about the world he was living in. He saw the mid-1950s as being more and more dominated by science and technology. Thus, the only fiction that was about life then was science fiction. It was a paradox. You see, people thought of science fiction as something fantastic and remote from ordinary experiences. Well, he felt that was the wrong impression to be left with. Rather, he saw science fiction as a marvelous area, a tremendously exciting area with great potential that should be explored. His first published short story, Prima Bella Donna, appeared in the magazine Science Fantasy in 1956. The situation for science fiction writers at the time was one every freelancer must dream about. Payments were small, a flat rate of £2 per 1,000 words. But the point about writing for science fiction magazines was that the demand was unlimited. There was pressure from the editor. If one had any talent at all, one could land a story in every issue of a magazine for a whole year. That's if you were productive and talented enough. He continued writing short stories until 1961, just upon the time he produced his first novel, The Wind from Nowhere. At the time, Ballard and his wife were extremely short of money. The one thing he wanted to do was give up his job as the editor of a scientific magazine and write a decent novel. He had 2 weeks of vacation coming up, and so his wife put forth a challenge, saying, "Why don't you, just for the hell of it, write a novel in 2 weeks?" He answered with The Wind from Nowhere, writing it in approximately 10 days. He set the formidable target of writing close to 6,000 words a day, which he kept up for 10 days. The book was no more than a potboiler, but that potboiler provided the funding that enabled him to give up that magazine job in order to concentrate on writing. Soon after his first serious novel, The Drowned World, was published in 1962, he followed it with The Drought in 1965 and The Crystal World in 1966, which are now generally known as the Catastrophic Trilogy. What came next, however, would truly cement his name as a writer to be reckoned with. Quote, "I believe that if it were possible to scrap the whole of existing literature, all writers would find themselves inevitably producing something very close to science fiction. No other form of fiction has the vocabulary of ideas and images to deal with the present, let alone the future." End quote. Ballard recalled quite clearly the wide-eyed excitement he experienced upon reading Treasure Island and Robinson Crusoe for the first time at the age of 7. He remembered a sense of curious vulnerability, the fear that his imagination might be overwhelmed by the richness of these invented worlds. Decades after reading these books as a child, he could return to the world of Long John Silver or the waves on Crusoe's island in his mind. The tales had left the pages and taken on a second life in his mind, leaving traces and influences. In his late teens, he read with a ravenous hunger, devouring an entire library of classic and modern fiction in a span of 3 to 4 years. From Cervantes to Kafka, from Jane Austen to Camus, he ran through their catalogs, often at the rate of a novel a day. Trying to find his way through the gray light of post-war austerity Britain, it was a relief to step into the rich and large-spirited world of a great novelist. Though he would become a legend within the genre of science fiction, he took very little influence from science fiction, feeling there was simply too little to learn from the genre at the time. He had a tremendous amount of respect for Ray Bradbury, however. For many years, he was the only science fiction writer Ballard read, but would later comment how he also found his work to be too romantic and too naive for him, and therefore never felt to mimic his style. Being weaned on classical English and American literature, he was fascinated by Edgar Allan Poe and Dino Buzzati. It was Franz Kafka, however, who made the biggest impression on him. He would go as far as calling him the most significant writer of the 20th century. Now, another struggle he had with science fiction authors of the time was that they were too American for him. He felt that the British authors did their best to imitate the Americans as well in order to get published in U.S. magazines, which was exactly the opposite of what he desired. Rather, he preferred the neutral tone of Robert Sheckley and Cyril Kornbluth. Now, if you really want to know what influenced J.G. Ballard the most, one has to go beyond the realm of literature and look at the painters like Max Ernst, Salvador Dali, Giorgio de Chirico, and René Magritte. It was the surrealists that mirrored on canvas what he sought to create with words. It was those dreamlike landscapes, those fascinating ways that some artists could create surrealistic images that resonated so very much with the psyche. Now, as a teenager growing up in China, he had seen and lived through what he considered to be the greatest surrealistic situation on the planet, the war. He would comment how he would wander the streets seeing half the houses in ruins. A car would be placed on top of one of the houses. It was like witnessing a surrealist painting or vice versa. He would later comment, "War is full of surreal surprises, full of surrealist images. Back then, it became clear to me that something in human culture was taking a dreadfully warped turn, and as an artist, a writer, I wanted to understand it." Now, interestingly, he would, in hindsight, somewhat regret that so much of his reading took place in his late adolescence, long before he had any adult experience of the world, long before he had any experience of falling in love, or understood his parents, or made his own living, or had time to reflect on the ways of the world. He would be left wondering with serious intensity what Kafka and Dostoevsky, Sartre and Camus would have meant to him if he hadn't been in such a rush and experienced them later in life, perhaps when he would have gotten something very different from those writings. Quote, "I take for granted that for the imaginative writer, the exercise of the imagination is part of the basic process of coping with reality, just as actors need to act all the time to make up for some deficiency in their sense of themselves." End quote. When it comes to its routine and structure, Ballard was more structured and routine-based than many writers. When an idea popped into his head which he saw potential in, he would always write a synopsis. Now, in the case of a short story, the synopsis would be about a page long, while in the case of a novel, the synopsis would be around the 25-page mark. He believed the synopsis allowed him to shape and flavor the story to a greater level than if he just jumped straight into writing the story without having planned it out. Now, following the synopsis, if satisfied with it, he'd write the piece. If not satisfied with how the story was taking shape, he could easily tweak it or discard it completely without too much lost time. Now, throughout his career, he would stick to a daily word goal of 1,000 words a day, doing everything possible to keep that goal, prioritizing consistency over inspiration. Now, the great bulk of his stories were written with quite the ease. Furthermore, he would state that about 10 of his stories were written once with minimal editing before they were deemed as final drafts. Also employing his synopsis first method, he never struggled with writer's block or found it difficult to finish a story. What he did find, however, was that after he finished a novel or a short story, particularly when concerning a novel that occupied his mind for 6 months to a year, it was more difficult to shake and start on something fresh. There would be a carryover of weeks, perhaps months. It was like the end of a love affair. Ballard described himself as very much a 9-to-5 writer, and a typical working day would go as follows. After he finished reading the newspaper after breakfast, he would travel the extensive 2 feet distance from his armchair to his desk. He would be seated there around 9:30 and type uninterrupted until about 12:30. Later in his career, he would substitute the typewriter with longhand writing, which he found less tiring than typing. Then he'd go run errands or for a walk. Upon returning home, he'd make lunch and generally be back at his typewriter by 1:30, working until approximately 5 o'clock, again uninterrupted. Now, sometimes if he was writing a section that flowed well and spilled out of him, he could easily go to 7. Generally, however, he'd call it quits at 5, ending the day with very stiff drink consisting of scotch and soda. Between The Crystal World, published in April 1966, and Crash, published in June 1973, James Ballard published nothing recognizable as a novel. He insisted that the realist novel had exhausted itself, which was sadly an easy claim to validate. Simultaneously, television was reaching an all-time high. Timothy Leary urged the world to tune in, turn on, and drop out with acid. The Beatles had gone to Nepal to meditate with the Maharishi, while the Vietnam War continued to escalate in its horribleness as the world watched. And reflecting the times, the year's bestsellers were not novels, but Truman Capote's In Cold Blood and Rush to Judgment by Mark Lane and Emile D'Antonio deconstructing The Warren Report. Our change was coming, and Ballard was itching to explore very extreme avenues of his psyche and creativity. By late 1970, he was deep into researching the novel Crash. Pressed later for what inspired the story, he would alternate between various origin stories. Sometimes, he said, the idea came to him when driving past a fatal traffic accident where he saw the body of a beautiful woman, half naked, spread over the back seat. On the other hand, he assured filmmaker Harley Cokeless that working with him on a BBC film about his book, The Atrocity Expedition, had been his inspiration. While neither of these alternatives were entirely untrue, Crash had too many sources of inspirations for all to be given credit. Adding to the numerous influences, one cannot exclude the fact that the death of his mother and his wife, leaving him with 3 children, left a huge impact. His wife, Mary, died from pneumonia in 1964, leaving him as a single father and somewhat broken. And while writing the novel, he was juggling the role of a single father, driving his children to school, collecting them, and so on and so on. Now, after delivering the children to school at 9:30 in the morning, he would pour himself a large scotch. He felt the scotch separated him from the domestic world in the same way a huge dose of Novocaine delivered by a dentist calms a patient so that what needs to be done can be done. For more than 2 years, Crash was the focal point of Ballard's artistic span of attention. He finished the first draft just before Christmas 1970 and resumed work on it in the new year. And during the whole of 1971, he published nothing new. Not only was it an intense effort of the imagination, the writing also demanded extensive research in the motoring press and books on car crash injuries. Never one to be social, he became even more isolated. Fellow science fiction writer and friend Charles Platt would explain that when he usually visited Ballard, they would go to the local pub and have a few pints. Not that Ballard seemed to enjoy it, as he always seemed eager to leave. Platt would speculate that Ballard engaged in these activities as a way to simulate what he believed to be common social behavior, trying to do what he thought they would want to do. The obsession over Crash, however, gave him an excuse to embrace his reclusive nature, doing so wholeheartedly. The manuscript for Crash was delivered early in 1972. Conscious of a huge task completed, he relaxed for the first time in 2 years. Relaxing for Ballard at the time meant drinking. Now, while drinking, he drove, refusing to believe it impaired his reactions. The character Vaughn from the novel spoke for Ballard when he observed that a few drinks always made a car go better. Unfortunately, this proved to be not so true outside the realm of the novel. And one evening, Ballard was driving back from, he guesses, a West End movie preview, conceivably that of Stanley Kubrick's A Clockwork Orange, when around midnight his car lost control at the bottom of Chiswick Bridge, demolished a road sign, turned over, and slid to a halt on the opposite side. And the accident became a part of the Ballard mythology, accumulating details with each retelling. At the time, his account was simple, explaining, I rolled a Zephyr across a dual carriageway and ended up on my head in the oncoming lane, tucked under the wall of Mortlake Cemetery. And by 1983, however, he added more detail, saying, I was driving along a dual carriageway at the bottom of Chiswick Bridge at about midnight. I think one of the tires blew out. The car swerved to the right, crossed a traffic island, demolishing a sign, rolled over onto its roof, and carried on along the oncoming lane. Cars were coming towards me, but luckily nobody hit me. I was wearing a seatbelt, and I remember as the car moved along, upside down, my face was only about 18 inches from the road, which was rushing past, lit by headlamps. I remember this sudden explosion of glass as the windshield collapsed. Then suddenly I could hear people shouting, Petrol, petrol, and discovered I could not open the doors because the roof had been crushed. But finally I managed to climb out. About 20 people gathered, and we rolled the car over, and I attempted to drive off, but was stopped by the police. I spent 3 days with a splitting headache, then went out, hired a car, drove to where the wrecked Zephyr was stored, and photographed it. I developed exactly the obsession I described in the atrocity exhibition. Now, the tire blowout, a later addition, is suspect, since a car with a blown tire is virtually undrivable. The photos he took of the car while it sat in the police pound don't include a shot of the blown tire, and from what one can see of the front tires, both appear intact. Now, Charles Platt insisted that Ballard originally said nothing about a blowout, leading him to press him on the cause of the accident. Well, Ballard allegedly threw up his hands and said, I just went out of control. Now, he later stated how, throughout the novel, he used the car not only as a sexual image, but as a total metaphor for man's life in today's society. As such, he went on to say, the novel has a political role, quite apart from its sexual content. But I would still like to think that Crash is the first pornographic novel based on technology. In a sense, pornography is the most political form of fiction, dealing with how we use and exploit each other in the most urgent and ruthless way. Needless to say, the ultimate role of Crash is cautionary, a warning against that brutal, erotic, and overlit realm that beckons more and more persuasively to us from the margins of the technological landscape. Crash would be the most condensed of his novels, one he laid a tremendous amount of effort into. He would usually burn his manuscripts upon completion and publication, but in the case of Crash, both the first draft and corrected typescript survive. The former is a barely decipherable maze of overscrawled second, third, and fourth thoughts. Even the clean copy he delivered to Cape in early 1972 is littered with his handwritten corrections. Now, the intensity of his effort is quite noticeable. As expected, the novel received divided reviews when originally published. One publisher's reader returned the verdict, this author is beyond psychiatric help. Do not publish. Our 1973 review in the New York Times was equally horrified. Crash is hands down the most repulsive book I've yet to come across. Upon publishing, Ballard never complained that Cape censored him, and it seems like the length of the novel rather than its content dictated most deletions, something which is proven by the fact that the most provocative episodes remained intact and, if anything, only occasionally was an image so outrageous that the editors intervened. However, retrospective opinion now considers Crash to be one of Ballard's best and most challenging works. Reassessing Crash in The Guardian, Zadie Smith wrote, Crash is an existential book about how everybody uses everything, how everything uses everybody, and yet it is not a hopeless vision. On Ballard's legacy, she writes, "In Ballard's work, there is always this mix of futuristic dread and excitement, a sweet spot where dystopia and utopia converge. For we cannot say we haven't got precisely what we dreamed of, what we always wanted so badly." Let's wrap up this episode with one last quote from the genius fetishist car wrecker himself. "I believe in the power of the imagination to remake the world, to release the truth within us, to hold back the night, to transcend death, to charm motorways, to integrate ourselves with birds, to enlist the confidence of madmen." End quote. Thank you for listening. I hope you've enjoyed this episode and will spread the word about the podcast. Once again, I have been your host, Jason Nemore Harden. We here at House of Words ask that you please consider helping to make this show easier to produce and more frequent by contributing on our Patreon page at patreon.com/houseofwords or paypal.me/houseofwordspodcast. Alternatively, you can like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube page and encourage others who may find what we offer interesting to do the same at House of Words Podcast. Every little bit helps, more than you might think. Until next time, keep turning those pages.
House of Words is written and produced by Cristo M. Sanchez. Narrated and written by me, Jason Nemore Harden. And music by Creature 9 and Wood. All rights and ownership belong to Cristo M. Sanchez and Jason Nemore Harden.